Hello and welcome back to Oh God What Now, recorded in a studio with the words Politics Podcast on the door in lovely gold script. We even got the fancy gold ink in, but now the printer doesn't work. I'm Andrew Harrison, and today the Chancellor's annual budget is bearing down on us like an approaching asteroid. And for once, it's not just a case of will there be 2p more on a pint of Guinness and maybe a Cornish pasty tax. Rachel Reeves' second budget is already being touted as possibly generational, a game changer, potentially a political watershed on a par with 1979, 1988, but maybe not the kamikaze budget of 2022. Faced with weak growth and a flatlining economy, Reeves has to find trillions to fill that financial black hole and invest in public services while sticking to strict financial rules. There's little doubt she'll have to bend or break the promises she made before the election not to raise taxes. Is this a moment when Britain has to accept that if it wants to rebuild itself, it has to accept the sort of tax rises that generally lose you an election? Are we really entering a new age of higher taxation, and what will it do to the rest of Labour's term? Here to help us explore it all is friend of the pod and electoral super wonk Giles Wilkes, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government, former Special Advisor to Theresa May and to Vince Cable in the Department for Business Innovation and Skills. Hello, Giles. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Andrew. It's brilliant to be here.
And also here is infrastructure lover, large building fetishist, Sunday Times bestselling author and creator of the newsletter of Not Quite Everything, Jonn Elledge. Hello, Jonn.
Hello, what an introduction. I do think if we had more infrastructure and large building, then maybe the budget would be a bit different.
But it would be different.
It would be different. Better. It would be better.
Okay,
we should have more infrastructure and large buildings. That's my take.
Okay.
I'm done.
Okay, if you're listening. Rachel Reeves, are you listening? Well, look, we might as well get straight into it. Giles, today is going to be a festival of, can you please put this in layman's terms, i.e. for me. Let's start off by talking about the immediate politics of it all. I mean, you've advised Theresa May on industrial economic policy, Vince Cable. You've seen how the sausage is made. Just how screwed is Rachel Reeves, and by extension us, at the moment?
I would say, on a scale of 0 to 10, probably about 7.5. In that the coalition thought they had a really bad inheritance and they had to deal with stuff. But I would say the Rachel Reeves inheritance was a lot worse, partly because the coalition did a lot of things that meant they couldn't be done again. And so the locker was bare by the time it came to Rachel Reeves. She had to find like 30 or 40 billion pounds to keep the show roughly on the road last October. But she then kind of wavered. They started off with the kind of narrative that you started with, which is we're going to have tough times. If we want nice things like great buildings and infrastructure, you first of all have to save, take some pain, raise some taxes, invest in it. And then you're going to get that stuff later. And they kind of did it last budget, but they didn't quite go all the way. They left too little sort of leeway. And as a result, when things went worse at the beginning of this year, interest rates rose, the economy was a bit weaker, they find they're going to have to come back and do it all over again. And the expectation, I think, is that they have to break some of the promises they made before the election, that they would fix all the finances without going to any of the really big taxes, the VAT, corporate tax, income tax, and so forth. So I think she's in quite a difficult position, but I think they've done a better job this time round of kind of warning people. So voters are not going to be at all surprised if it's a pretty shitty budget.
Yeah, and we'll get into the detail of that in a minute. But I mean, historically, how does this bad inheritance, you mentioned 2010, taking the long view, how does the bad inheritance, I mean, have chancellors arrived to deal with worse situations than this? I mean, I'm going to say probably after wars, but let's not think about wars.
Yeah, I'm sure I've been on a podcast before with you where I've had to utter the phrase Stafford Cripps or something like Dennis Healey. I mean, I would say, like, in terms of like forcing immediate austerity issues, it's not quite as bad as it was after the big devaluations we had in, what was it, 1949, 1967, 1976. Each time when you're in those sorts of situations, you're being told there's going to be a run on the currency unless you do something immediately. In fact, we had a modern flavour of this in 2022, where a similar sort of thing happened that said, if you don't reverse your policy immediately, things are going to spiral. Now, she's not in a spiral position, partly because I think she's really given out sensible person vibes. And there's no remote prospect, except in the wild imaginations of Nigel Farage, that we're going to have a kind of bond market revolt that makes it worse. And then you have to do more and then it gets it worse. And you end up in that kind of bank run situation. So I think we've been in worse situations before. I would say, actually, if you read enough economic history, it's very normal for chancellors to say, we just need to raise some taxes. It's because we've told the public for so long, hey, we can do all this without raising taxes, that it's seen as such a problem. I always say that people say Britain's in a crisis. We're a 5p rise in VAT away from not having a crisis at all. And that's not a country in a crisis that, oh, if consumer prices rose a little bit, we'd be all fine. That's not a crisis.
I mean, is it purely a matter of the endlessly discussed financial black hole, or are there more serious underlying structural problems that are going to need addressing, if not now, soon?
Well, the bigger problem is that we don't have enough growth. I mean, and that's the underlying reason that all of the fiscal and financial problems are a problem. So if you can rely on the idea that once you sort of clear away the immediate storm clouds of whatever's affecting the economy will then grow at 2.5% or 3%, which is what we used to think about 10 or 15 years ago. If you could just rely on that kind of pathway just wipes away problems within a few years. The problem we really have is that nobody's absolutely certain if we'll ever get back to that. Most people probably expect that the really best times are over, and that actually if Rachel Reeves and all of her colleagues knock the ball out of the park, they might get growth back to 2%. And the higher that number is, the more that it just makes everything easy. If you have growth returning to 3%, you're playing politics on easy mode. You just need to sort of wait it out and you'll get there. And it's that assumption that makes it so different, which is why people talk about why can't we build things? Why can't we get infrastructure? Why is growth such a difficult thing to achieve? So, I would say that's the really big structural one. The other structural one is that the voters have been told, as I say, they keep being told you can have things for nothing. And that just makes the problem really, really hard. But that's something you've got to blame the politicians for.
So you've already kind of alluded to the theory, which I certainly buy, that the coalition did the wrong things with austerity. It kind of failed to invest in infrastructure when money was cheap. All the cuts were they cut a load of stuff from capital budgets as well as current spending. So can we just blame austerity for all this, or is there something deeper going on?
It's a really fascinating one. I would say I'm one of those people who's sort of 3/4 towards the direction of saying that the policy was wrong then. But I do think several arguments. When austerity was being conducted, it also looked like it was slowing the economy a little bit. Not as catastrophically as everybody thought at the time, where they thought we were in a recession. But I would say that we were running the economy too cold for a few years, which means we just had we left growth off the table. So the economy could now be a little bit bigger, just if we'd run it a little bit harder. Inflation was too low. We could have just been a bit more ambitious, but they wanted to prioritize the public finances. That's number one. That's a couple of percent of GDP, which would be wonderful. Number two is I think they went too hard after public services and told people that you can have tax cuts at the same time as public sector austerity. I got very cross as an advisor in there that we kept pursuing this policy of taking people out of tax, which is crazy when you're saying, oh, by the way, we can't afford hospitals or decent prisons or a well-funded local government or the capital budget. But in the meantime, we're going to take people out of tax. It's a very confused message. And it meant that just later governments had to put people back into tax. So I think we should have had a mix that was much more like that radical socialist Ken Clarke tried in the early 90s, when he said it should be 50% spending, 50% tax, and do it at a sort of gradual pace that will get us out of this. It was far too politically timed, and it was far too based on spending cuts. And as a result, I think we got a weaker public services problem, underinvested NHS during that time, underinvested economy. And so, I think the economy could now be a bit stronger and the public debt a bit lower if we'd actually done all of those things perfectly.
So, I do like blaming the coalition. So, sorry, Giles. I enjoy that. But it is unfortunately true that, if you look across the West, growth does seem to have slowed down to a crawl in a lot of countries. I mean, the US is the big exception, maybe Australia. But, right across Europe and Canada and so on, those kind of 2-3% growth rates do look like a thing of the past. Do we have any idea about why that is?
I'm very strongly of the view that the most irritating phrase in all of politics and economics is the productivity puzzle. Because if this is one of those things, for a start, all the economists should just fire themselves if they think that after 15 years of looking at this thing and studying it, they don't really know the answers. So I think the answers are fairly clear. If we focus on Britain, first of all, I would say that we've made policy mistakes in the last 15 years, of which sort of the wrong flavour of austerity is only one of them. Brexit is a really massive one. We think that's worth about 4% to the level of our GDP. I think we've had a bad recovery from COVID, which is all messed up with the Brexit thing. But we haven't had the usual rising employment And I don't know what exactly we've done, but that's certainly worth something. We're highly dependent on Russian gas for our energy pricing. The price shock that hit poor old Liz Truss, who otherwise did everything absolutely perfectly, I'm sure,
Yeah.
3 years ago. I do hope there's a kind of irony filter in this thing. Was a monumental shock. It was right up there with the shock that hit 70s governments with the oil price shock. And that takes a long time to work its way through. Trump is a massive shock too. We used to have, from the time like Tony Blair became leader of the Labour Party to the time Tony Blair stopped being leader of the Labour Party, this beautiful tailwind of China entering the global economy, giving us stuff at ever cheaper amounts. And that's just a wonderful cost of living bonus. And that just turned around and stopped. And instead we have this sort of gangsterism from across the Atlantic, which affects business confidence, but also just the prices of things. So I think we've got at least 4 like really big shocks, if you throw in the pandemic itself, that have caused us just to be knocked off our perch a bit. But also, you talk about the whole world and how it's been affected. I think some of those, like globalization, you can only incorporate the Chinese once into your global economy. I think aging economies start slowing down a little bit too. So the sort of age dependency ratios are going to get worse and worse and worse. But I think if you took some of those sort of one-off shocks away and started doing better, more rational policy making, like Labour sort of promised 2 years ago, and we're not quite sure they're doing yet, we could get back to nearly there, and things would feel a lot better.
Giles, you just mentioned Brexit, and I'm glad you did, because I was going to bring it up at some point. Earlier this month, Rachel Reeves sort of committed the public heresy of telling the IMF that Brexit was largely responsible for the state of Britain. She was very careful. She said it was the way that Britain left the EU, not leaving the EU as a principle, basically, i.e., heavily subtweeting Boris Johnson and David Frost. But when you're faced with the kind of political cost of raising taxes, which we all know, we can predict the front pages, or the political cost of going, you know what, Brexit, worth 4%, as you've just described, 3% growth in GDP is a total game changer. Why one and not the other? Because it kind of seems that, the treating of Brexit as an absolutely sacred, iconic thing that cannot be questioned in any way is now completely, it's the thing that the events of 10 years ago, many of the people who voted for it are dead. Why are we clinging to this? And actually, why has Labour let itself in potentially much, much more pain?
I mean, I don't get involved in these focus groups with angry reform-inclined voters that seem to terrify the Labour strategists so badly. I think a lot of people are really scarred by, and I was part of this, the illusory feeling we had I had this when I was a Theresa May SPAD, which tells you what a terrible appointment I was, that we could maybe reverse the thing, point out the error of people's ways. All of these people who angrily voted Brexit would realise that I'm very sorry, sir, for making my mistake. And it was we got it so badly wrong in 2019, including, I mean, the Lib Dems, of whom I was still a member, they really played it so badly wrong that I think it scarred people. A mistake like that, just like the mistake the Tories made around Black Wednesday or the mistake Labour made around 1976, it lasts on a movement for a long, long time. So I think you're right. We should stop acting like that. That is the great sin. And also, I think we all know that Labour is losing support mostly to its left, to the Lib Dems and the Greens, not the Reform people. But, I don't think people get over that kind of a mistake quickly, must be my best explanation.
Giles, debt is another huge kind of, bugbear. You mentioned it earlier. The national debt is now about 95% of GDP. The annual interest bill is more than 100 billion. It's about 8.3% of total government spending. So, a huge part of these very, very painful tax rises that we're almost certainly going to get are just going to go towards servicing debt. The voter pays more and gets nothing visible for it. A, how does a smart chancellor pull that off? And B, is this more of a failure of telling the story and explaining why this is happening than in policy itself?
I think it is arguably the most important sort of under-discussed change in economic circumstance for the last 10 years. The fact that we got really used to the idea that interest rates and debt were not a problem. And it was a kind of political argument about borrowing to invest or not. When debt interest amounts are this much, it's not an ideological thing anymore. It's a straight cash thing. Cash is having to leave the exchequer in order to pay for this. So sorry, your question is sort of how can a chancellor sort of explain their way around this? I think the problem is here. It's like the boy who cried wolf. For so long, the people who are associated with fiscal rules and the grown-ups in the room who complain about debt were complaining when there really wasn't a wolf at the door, and we could have done more. And now it's coming along. People think, oh, why don't you just get rid of the rules? And say, no, there really now is a wolf. It's right here. So they really need to explain all the time. The way you put it right there, this is the amount we're spending all the time simply on servicing everything that we invested in, we borrowed over the last 20, 30 years. It's a really important point that they need to make, that we often get distracted by arguing about things like fiscal rules or whether we have this chancellor or that chancellor. It is a fact of life that even if you got rid of the OBR, got rid of the fiscal rules, had an entirely different chancellor, the same reality would be hitting. And I think they just need to be much more clear about that.
Yeah, because when you look at it, you go like, if you measure that out in hospitals, it's a shitload of hospitals that aren't happening.
I mean, the truth is, though, we did something with the money. We borrowed the money and kept people afloat during COVID, and we invested in various bits of infrastructure at various times. We did something with that borrowing. Otherwise, we would have had to have raised taxes in the past. It's not like we got literally nothing for it, but it's just there is now a really important trade-off. If you want to do more now, there's going to be a bill to pay. And that's something that we could kind of pretend wasn't the case when interest rates were 1 or 2%.
Is it the case that with debt, the only real levers you've got are increasing growth, which you've talked about, reducing borrowing, which is painful, or with lower interest rates, which are not really in the control of the Chancellor anyway? I mean, what levers has she got?
Well, your levers are cut spending, which I think we can't really do very much more of, and there's a difficult political argument to be had with Labour backbenchers about large parts of it. There's raised taxes. There's try to increase growth in certain ways. There's funny little tricks that you'll get recommended by officials to do the borrowing, but in different ways, like the PFI contracts and so forth, or setting up sort of corporations that do the investing instead of the government directly. But no, I think ultimately cash is the most honest, is the thing that makes everybody have to behave honestly, whether it's a finance director of a company or a chancellor. And there isn't an easy way around. The last one, I shouldn't miss this out because it's the way we dealt with it before, is something called financial repression, which is where basically you force people to keep buying your debt at artificially low interest rates while you inflate it away. And that is how the chancellors dealt with it from 1945 to about 1980.
That's how we paid for the war.
Yeah, and I mean, the Second World War and the First World War. We somehow paid for the Napoleonic Wars just by being hard-ass Victorians for about 100 years.
Well, didn't they also introduce income tax, which had never really existed before, to pay for the Napoleonic Wars?
Yeah. What's incredible nowadays is thinking of the Chancellor sitting there with like a staff of 100 or hundreds and hundreds doing the budget. Basically, William Pitt the Younger and a few bottles of port came out with the idea of an income tax and kept one working for 20 years. It's incredible what they managed to do. Yeah, but he invented income tax. It was probably gotten rid of and then brought back again by someone like Disraeli or Gladstone.
Wait, Liz gets out. Liz Truss is an avid listener. She'll come back saying, we're going to abolish income tax. It was only a temporary thing. I mean, as we said, it's going to be a tax raising budget. The papers are already full of Labour's tax raid, new tax of the day. She's going to loot every penny you've got, which we would expect from the Tory and Reform Press. But, the Chancellor has been supposedly rolling the pitch for this stuff, getting people ready. Do you think she's done it especially well?
That's interesting. I think they've been wavering in that at the beginning they came in and it was like shocked face, big black hole in the finances. We're going to have to take emergency measures, winter fuel. Keir Starmer made a speech August last year where he said it's frankly things are going to get worse before they get better. And then that kind of went away when they had a bit of a scare around the beginning of the year. And they started saying, well, growth is great for people's living standards. And then they reversed on the winter fuel taxes. And then they failed to drive through anything on welfare. And they kind of started talking about how we care as much about how you're feeling right now, as opposed to this austerity now, better times in the future thing. So, and now they're having another go at it in the last few months. I think they've allowed outriders to talk about tax rises. They've got intelligent think tankers out there polling people saying, how would you feel about her saying this? How do you feel about this reframing of things as being Brexit's fault and Trump's fault? And the smartest thing I heard conference was that the voters are willing to sort of see this, because voters are kind of bleakly non-idealistic in a way that maybe elected parliamentarians are not. So they say, yeah, we understand that politicians make promises and always go back on them. We want to see that it's being done for the right reason. The think tank was optimistic that Labour could survive becoming a bit of a tax-raising party again. It was the parliamentarians who were more worried about it. They were worried that the mythical person on the doorstep is going to punch them on the nose for raising income tax or going back on a promise. And that was the last thing I heard about that. But I think they're doing a better job of rolling the pitch than previous chancellors. Previous chancellors often just came out with it as a surprise and hoped that in a blizzard of detail, the voters wouldn't notice, and often had terrible mistakes as a result.
It's very hard not to notice income tax going up, though, isn't it? It's not like, I mean, even the pasty tax. I mean, most people don't eat pasties. I love a pasty, but that one got torn to pieces.
Oh, that was a feast of fun. That was.
I bet.
I mean, or the 10p, the removal of the 10p band that Gordon Brown did in 2008. He'd only introduced it a few years before, but people acted like their birthright from the Norman conquest onwards had been taken away from them. It was terrible.
Well, this question of breaking manifesto commitments, I mean, it's a huge stick for the press to beat a chancellor with.
Yeah.
But people will wear it sometimes. I mean, the 2019 Tories were committed to small government and ended up running the biggest intervention in people's personal lives that a government had conducted since the Second World War because of the pandemic. And people went, yeah, get it. It's understandable. People do seem to understand that, the world changes and you can't be bound by a promise that you made, 18 months ago when the circumstances have changed enormously.
I agree. And I also think it's unfair because I think worthy centre-left people who set themselves up as responsible guardians of the public finances and be believers in government doing good for people are more likely to be punished by voters because of their very earnestness. Whereas you put a total joker in charge, like, I don't know, for example, Boris Johnson, and they kind of expect all sorts of craziness and think, oh yeah, of course, but we never believed anything he said. I do get the feeling that the centre left are held to a much higher standard here. In particular, 95% of all the problems they've got are still because of the inherited load of stuff most of it is not because of anything they've done. And yet they're going to be held responsible for it.
Jonn, I want to ask you a question. Lucy Powell, brand new deputy leader of the Labour Party, has been popping up this week saying the party should stick to the promises, not raise taxes on working people, the famous quotes working people, which is always can be a bit fuzzily defined, usually means national insurance, income tax and VAT. She's been voted in not from the Starmer wing of the party, but from the kind of membership end of the party. She might be right, but is it helping?
Well, no, obviously it's not helping. But I don't think that's really what it's for. No, you could argue that the most flattering reading is you could argue that it shows that these decisions are not being made lightly. That, if the deputy leader is going around saying, we shouldn't be raising taxes on working people, then the situation really must be bad. The Labour Party is a broad church; it reflects a whole range of it. But I think that's clearly nonsense. I don't believe that, even as the words coming out my mouth. It's probably more about Lucy Powell kind of like staking out her own position. And showing where she stands for the future. I mean, it does seem to be a weird thing that I've noticed on social media the last year or two, that there is the rise of what one might term the anti-tax left. There are a whole bunch of people who now think that raising taxes is a right-wing position, which feels a bit bizarro world. I think it's a weird. To some extent, it's the cost of living crisis. Obviously, no one has any money. To some extent, it's a weird side effect of the Tories did raise a lot of taxes, even though they pretended otherwise. But I see people who definitely think they're to the left of me shouting at me for going around saying that I think we're going to need to raise taxes, as if I'm the one taking a right-wing position there.
But is it like raising taxes on everyone is a right-wing position, whereas raising taxes on rich people is something they'll be happy with?
Yeah,
or is it just kind of vibe shift against taxes in general?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, there's a lot more people who are like, we should raise taxes on the rich, and they don't realise that a lot of the problem is our median taxes are lower than they should be for the level of things we want the state to do. But also, I do just think there has been this sort of weird vibe shift of people do feel, even quite, even kind of middle income people feel poor at this point. They're struggling the last few years. And I understand that. I have some sympathy with that. and the fact that people then turn around and go, well, I can't afford to pay more taxes. But it doesn't change the fact that, like, to get us out of this situation, we are probably going to need to, because actually, like, the sort of the median earner is not paying the level of taxes that someone in a comparable European country would be.
I'm just saying that my first foray into public policy 15 years ago, when they had that fiscal crisis, was to say council tax is ridiculous. You should have a higher levy on expensive London homes, and it's really nice to see that 15 years later they're willing to do it. I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. American states everywhere, American municipalities raise money by having a proportional property tax, and somehow they've kept capitalism alive. So we should have it here.
Jonn, as a housing wonk, are you pro capital gains tax on the houses over, I don't know, £1 million or whatever it is, or £500,000?
I mean, as Giles alludes to, we should definitely do something of that sort, if only because we are quite unusual in having such limited property taxes and those sort of other wealth taxes. So much of our national wealth is locked up in property, and it does just seem like an obvious area that is currently undertaxed, where there are things you could do. My fear is that they're kind of going to tinker around the edges slightly, when, like, ideally there will be kind of like complete reform in this area. I don't know if we go as far as like a land value tax or something, but something much bigger than actually seems to be on the table, where the balloons being floated seem to be in the kind of whole mansion tax area, or a couple of extra council tax bans. And I think those would be broadly good, but I do worry that it's not going to raise enough money to justify the rain of shit that's going to fall on the Labour Party's head when they try and do this.
What's it going to do to the housing market, which is the thing that really keeps you up at night, because you want more houses in bigger buildings, cheaper for more people?
Well, I mean, we don't know, but it is possible that because there are people who own massive expensive houses that they bought for tuppence in 1972, who do not have particularly high incomes because they're pensioners on fixed incomes or whatever it is. We're going to see bad headlines about how, pensioners who can't afford to pay a tax might be sort of forced to move out of their homes. That would be quite difficult politically. It would probably be good for the housing market, because there are a lot of like overhoused older people and underhoused families. I'm going to get complaints about boomer bashing again, aren't I? I can already feel it coming. But in terms of kind of like the way people move around the housing market, that's probably a good thing in terms of freeing up bedrooms. The downside, other than the political one and the fact that I'm going to get letters, would be, I think there are a lot of kind of older people who think it's important for them to have a big home for like the kids and the grandkids to be able to come around to, because nobody in the next generation has been able to afford somewhere that's kind of big enough to do family Christmas or whatever. So there would be friction, but I think probably actually higher property taxes actually sort of improve the workings of the property market. I don't know what Giles thinks.
No, I mean, if you get rid of stamp duties and you have higher taxes on the immovable property, in other words, just an annual charge, that every economist will say that's a much, much better idea. You want activity. People should not be sitting around in houses that are too big for them purely because they think there's going to be a 10% wedge taken out of the price if they try and sell it. And if it does have a high recurring charge, they've got an even better reason to leave. So I think that combination would get the housing market moving and more property sitting in the right hands. So I think the combination she's looking at is definitely the one that economists and therefore the Treasury would like. It's remarkable to think it was George Osborne who stuck some massive stamp duty going up to 10 or 15% on the most expensive properties. And it's one of the least sort of free market capitalist things that you could have imagined doing to that market.
I'm just thinking about the political context of all this, because, in the old days, a Labour Chancellor would go up against a Tory shadow who'd say, you're a jealous wealth hater and you're removing incentives for people to start businesses. But now, Rachel Reeves is also going to be up against Reform, who'll tell a load of lies that she's spending all the money on migrants, and she'll go up against the Greens, who will probably say she's not spending enough on green power, but then, as Jonn often points out, will often block green infrastructure projects, and the Lib Dems who'll say this is not the Labour Party you voted for. It's actually a totally different ballgame, isn't it? It's not just like straight across the aisle, glass of whiskey, look the Tories in the eye and sort of spout Labour values. You've got to fight on a million fronts.
Well, I think this is one of the things that makes the Labour Party's current sort of attempts at triangulation completely mad because triangulation. I was going to get into a terrible metaphor saying it's like hexagonization or whatever it is, which doesn't work at all. But like they're constantly kind of like trying to work out what the unpopular position is, what the position is that will lose them votes, and to not take that. And I think this is complete nonsense. I think they need to just kind of like work out what they think is the right thing to do, make the argument for it. Stop kind of like just sort of chasing where they think the sort of least bad headlines are going to be, because they're going to piss some people off. That is inevitable. So just do what you think is right, and then have the courage of your convictions and argue for it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's fair to say she's not a popular politician. I mean, I really hate this spiteful Rachel from accounts thing that's flying around, which is just purely sexist and demeaning.
Yeah,
and
it's
just
misogyny.
ugly and nasty.
So, Giles, well, we got you. I found this piece you wrote in The Guardian in 2020 in which you noted that Osborne had underspent in 2013 and then Sunak had overspent in 2020, and that, you know, both of these were bad, but circumstances had changed. So, like, is it possible that things might change again in a way that, like, when nobody's primed for right now? Like, is it possible that in 5 years' time we're going to have forgotten all this because we're going to be dealing with a completely different type of things? Like, maybe the economy overheats. Maybe suddenly we get some growth. Is that plausible?
I mean, it's astonishing to think. It's one of the reasons I think we should have a national holiday on October the 6th, which is Giant Toad Squatting Day, because it was October the 6th, 2021. We all remember this. 2021, where we all thought we were going to have 10 more years of Boris Johnson. That, you know, we had Rishi Sunak as a chancellor, and a totally different set of circumstances. Circumstances changed about 4 times the next few years. And I remember actually when I was an undergraduate back in the early 90s, and people were trying to describe how awful it was that Ken Clarke having to deal with this big deficit, and we keep having recessions every 3 or 4 years, and we're never going to get out of it, and Britain's bust. And within 5 or 6 years, it was cool, Britannia, fiscal surplus, aren't we great? And things can turn around really quite quickly. And I think, referring back to the earlier point about how many different things have sideswiped the UK economy, things could get just much better. They sometimes just pick up without people even realising why. In 2013, The Economist had a picture of George Osborne on the front in a bust car with no wheels saying, "Where's the plan, George? It's all gone tits up, hasn't it?" And it was really mocking. And at that moment, the economy started growing at 2.5% or 3%. And nobody exactly knew why, because that's just what the macro economy is like. So things could definitely get better. And I do hope they can just hold their nerve and keep to their principles. And they might find in 2 years' time, they've got the economy 4 or 5% higher. Public services are turning around a little bit. Everyone's sick and tired of the sight of Farage, as we all ought to be by then. And they're wondering why on earth were we panicking so much about it? It's perfectly possible. And just because so many awful things have happened in the last few years, we've assumed it doesn't ever get better.
Well, we're going to move on to look at the broader and the deeper facets of the British economy in a minute. Let's take a quick breather and a bit of news about our fantastic companion podcast, The Bunker. There's a brand new regular franchise in the show called Weekly Wrap Up. Every Friday, our regulars sum up the big stories of the week and give you a new takeaway on the most important, the strangest, the standout tales that didn't get the attention they deserve, and the heroes and villains of the week too. Get it on the Bunker feed every Friday. Here's a snippet of the current one, with me and Alex von Tunzelman discussing the very interesting new signage at the White House. You can listen right now. There's a link in the show notes. Finally, let's wrap up with what may turn out to be a regular feature on this podcast, a little thing we like to call, "What the fuck has Donald Trump done now?" Alex, this week it is, you may have seen this, a monstrously tacky little sign in gold script, pinned or sellotaped outside the Oval Office, and it says the Oval Office.
Yes,
and it's got a major strip club stroke bad golf club energy. The internet had an absolute field day with it. Blue sky amongst the descriptions were the Oval Office, please wait to be seated. Live, laugh, love fascism. The table will share an onion blossom, which I thought was particularly good.
Excellent.
And somebody said, this is like when my roommates went crazy with one of those Dymo label guns and they labeled everything. Even the walls had a sticker on that said wall, floor, toilet. Will there be one on the president that says president? He doesn't know where he is. He needs it because he doesn't know where he is.
I mean, that's the speculation, right?
Yeah.
They're like, who needs a sign on the Oval Office saying the Oval Office? We all know what the Oval Office
that
is.
Oval Office.
Not the other one. Not the Square Office.
Not the one in Scam. Yeah.
Not the Triangle Office. The
Yes,
Oval
I know,
Office.
yeah.
It did. I mean, my favourite comment was saying that there's saying, oh, dog, not the Steakhouse Wedding font, which really is what it is, right? Steakhouse Wedding is exactly what it looks like. And it just seems to be printed on A4, as you say. But yeah, there is speculation. I mean, obviously, Trump, the ongoing story that clearly Trump is losing his faculties somewhat, right? And I mean, I think, this is sort of now quite widely spoken about. You've had people like J.B. Pritzker talking about, it's obviously happening. Could we discuss the fact the president is clearly having some mental difficulties? Not helped yesterday by him giving a speech where he went on and on about how, for years Miami had been a haven for people fleeing communist South Africa.
Yeah.
Which isn't true. Maybe meant South America, although also not really that communist, apart from Cuba,
Bit of communism here and there.
Yeah, I mean, really sort of, and kept going on about South Africa and clearly had just completely transposed the two places and sort of merged them.
Right, let's get back to the economy and look maybe at some of the deeper stuff that's on the go. There are huge questions about the fundamentals in Britain's economy and why we're in the state we're in. Giles, the kind of the pub guy version of the analysis goes, Britain used to be a manufacturing country with a huge imperial marketplace. Well, then that collapsed. We turned it into a service economy where everybody lived on debt. We subsidised low wages with generous benefits. And then that became a political football. And now we've come to the end of the road and we're screwed. Is that Chat GPT, Andrew? Is that close enough to the truth?
No, I mean we're much better than that. We obviously have clear problems, as every country has. I mean, we all envy America. If you go and talk to Americans, they say 3/4 of the country is screwed, and there's just a few bits that are racing away. It's likewise, any country seems to have problems with it. Number one, on the manufacturing stuff, we still have a pretty decent manufacturing sector. It's 8% of the economy. In other countries, it might be 10 or 11%. But what we have is still pretty good, particularly given the massive sort of kick in the painful parts we gave it through the Brexit debacle. Number two, I mean, there's nothing unsustainable about therefore having a services economy. Through all of history, services are most of what happens. And we do a lot of services really, really well. We do creative services fantastically well. Some financial services is actually needed and the world likes it, and legal services and consultancy and all sorts of other things like that. I mean, there's a piece in The Economist this week, I think, about Britain and how its brand is seen. It's seen as like the third most trusted and sort of place to come and do business. It really isn't seen elsewhere by people as a terrible place. And in particular, the people who jet in from other centres of economic excellence and land in London, they look around and say London is amazing. And obviously that points to the next point, which is obviously not everything is doing amazing. Our second cities are lagging the frontier way more than other countries see that. And that's a problem we've had for like 20, 30, 40 years, or at least since deindustrialization. And we've never really adequately dealt with that. But that's because we've had a kind of clown show attempt at it a lot of times. Anytime we seem to have something working, in comes the next lot, scrap it. So I think this government, again, has they've noticed the problem. They want to devolve power and get things moving more in the regions. And that's kind of like cross-party consensus. So I don't think we're in such a terrible mess. I don't think there's anything unsustainable about the way our economy grows. I don't think we're as addicted to debt as the rhetoric suggests. This is where I turn to Jonn for the details, but I don't think we've been using negative mortgage equity withdrawal for a long time. We used to, like, houses would go up and you would borrow against them and you were actually taking money out and you were funding yourself in a way that if house prices ever fell, which they kind of need to, you'd be in awful trouble. I don't think we've been doing that mortgage equity withdrawal for a long while. So I don't think we're in such a terrible problem. We've got some self-inflicted injuries, but really, given all the stuff we've been hit with and some of the people that have been ruling us, we could be a lot worse.
It's the most optimistic podcast ever, Jonn.
Well, I mean, secretly, although nobody's really talking about it, house prices have kind of stabilised or even wobbled a little bit. It's just they haven't done so in absolute terms, so people haven't really noticed. But if you compare them, if you look at them as a multiple of wages, the peak was a few years ago. But anyway, leaving that aside, I mean, like you mentioned the second cities problem. And I mean, it's certainly true if you go to a lot of our regional cities, they don't have the same sort of quiet prosperity that you see in like a Munich or a Lyon. And one of the biggest, most obvious ways in which that shows itself is they often don't have very good transport networks and so forth. So is the core of our problem just chronic underinvestment? I mean, it does just seem like we just haven't built a lot of the stuff we needed to build at some point.
I mean, I strongly believe that. And also the fact that we try to make those decisions in London. Like when I was in Downing Street in the 2017-18, we had the ridiculous sight of Downing Street wonks poring over maps of the north, going, are these real place names? And wondering whether the Northern Powerhouse Rail should work in this way or that way. It shouldn't be our sort of decision. I bet you in Lyon and Bordeaux, the decisions are made by the local mayors, and maybe even the revenue is raised by the local politicians. And so we have a system where it kind of like forced helplessness, because then they don't develop the capabilities or the mindset to do it, and we can never get it going. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone keeps making the point that Leeds is the largest city in the Western Hemisphere that doesn't have a decent tram system or something like that. These are like, it's not like we have to invent the next chat GPT or solve nuclear fusion. These are basic things that we haven't been doing, so they're surely solvable.
I mean, something I wonder about a lot and have asked on this podcast before, in fact, is that, you know, a few times in the 20th century, the sort of economic model that not just Britain, but a lot of Western economies were kind of built on faltered and something else happened. So you sort of saw that around the beginning of the 20th century. You sort of saw that again after World War II and again around 1979. It felt like maybe 2008 should have been one of those moments, and it wasn't. Like, the old model broke and we still don't have a new one. I'm just wondering if you have any sort of views on what the hell's happened there.
I mean, this is, for me, one of the most central discussions. So thank you for never giving me an easy question. I mean, and it was kicked off in a fantastic Substack by Ben Ansell. There's been a recent one by Jeff Mulgan, all about, you know, where's the vision, where's the model? I'm the most ultimate centrist dad, and I think we also stopped doing all the straightforward, pragmatic, normal things. The global financial crisis, we responded to pretty well as a crisis, but then we came out of it a bit too slow. That was not about a model. It was just about aiming off. I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with free market capitalism as a system, but it's, you know, it just took an absolutely monumental shock and took a long while to recover from it. A lot of people would say otherwise, that there's the problem with Labour is not so much that they're unlucky or they're doing the wrong things, but they don't have an overall framework or theory that ties it all together. And I can see that in that they seem to be a real magpie. They want to be like Schumpeterian innovators in one place and sort of developmentalist investors in other places. And it's all a bit confusing. And what I say is that it's not so much I want a brilliant theory like a John Maynard Keynes or a Milton Friedman or a J.K. Galbraith in the middle with a beautiful book about it all. I just want a single brain that the government machine can refer to and say, what are we doing here? Who's making the final decision? What does this thing about immigration matter more than this thing about growth? I get the sense that it's just like totally discordant inside, that there isn't a single economic brain like we used to have when Ed Balls was the advisor to Gordon Brown or Rupert Harrison was to George Osborne. So I see it in a really dull and boring way as an organizational managerial thing almost, that I don't really care about their model so long as it's not an insane one. It's just, can there be a few obvious characters of authority in the government to tie everyone together around the same agenda?
If you could, I mean, is it possible to kind of hack through the thickets of all the confusion and describe their economic policy in theoretical terms? I mean, do they really have one? Is what I'm saying underneath all this.
I think it's pretty much the same one. I mean, the you know the phrase Butskillism that used to be applied to the consensus after the war about Gaitskell and
that's old school.
That's old school. This one is the phrase used by the Bajot columnist. I think it was probably Duncan Robinson, so shout out to him. Is Heavesian, so Hunt and Reeves. They basically agree, which is you need fiscal stability because interest rates are high, and you'll really find out about it if you're not. You need higher investment. We need to do something about regional growth. We should pick a few growth sectors, but not have an industrial strategy for absolutely everything. Isn't AI fantastic? Keep the science budget rising. And it's kind of institutionalism in that, particularly with Trump out there doing things in a transactional gangster way, we should be the people where you absolutely know that our word is good, that we're going to be unpolitical and reliable. And ultimately that will get business investment rising again and all of the sort of normal free market things working. That is the government's policy. They don't put it quite so boldly, but she says stability, investment and reform. And I think she and Hunt would have been fine on a job share on a lot of it.
Well, I guess calling it Heavesianism is better than calling it Runtianism. At least it sounds a bit better, doesn't it, really?
Draft one, yeah.
Yes.
Just one more thing from me. I want to read you a quote from that article from 2020 I found of yours. The truth is that fiscal policy is always more of a political choice than the politicians like to admit. Faced with the enormous implications of their decisions, some may find it easier to blame the markets or the unavoidable dictates of timeless rules than admit to real agency. Can you kind of like unpack that for us a little bit? And like, to what extent are you saying that chancellors have more or less power than they sometimes pretend?
Oh, they have flexibility. I mean, trying to remember what I used to think when I was a young man of 48 here. But look, okay, something that winds me up is a certain prominent politician came in and was talking about the coalition era and said, we had no choice. We had no choice at all. I thought, you still had choices. You had choices about the timing. Should we do it over 5 years, 4 years, 8 years? You had choices about the flavour of how you were going to do it. Should we raise taxes by 10% of the problem, 50% of the problem, 80% of the problem? There are always choices, and people should have institutions like the Bank of England to deal with the inflation target. But even there, you can say, should your inflation target be 2 or 3? Should it be a nominal GDP target? How much should you vary from it? There's always a political choice. And voters vote for politicians because they know this. They sometimes know this better than the politicians. They say, look, I don't quite like the way the system's working. You've either got to make it work better or change it. And so I do think there's something slightly bad faith about them saying, oh, really, I had no choice at all. You say, Holman, let's drill down, and you'll find that there was one. They just preferred something else to the difficult thing you're asking for. I mean, like in your area of where you're talking about planning things, when they say, well, we've got no choice here, you could have changed the rules or overridden this other consideration or this environmental thing. That was a choice too. So there were always choices. I'm thinking that's what young Wilkes thought. Anyway.
I'm going to put you on the spot finally. Imagine alternate timeline, sliding doors. Suddenly, you find yourself in the room with Rachel Reeves, and you have been for 10 years. What is the one piece of advice you're giving to her this week? I mean, obviously, pretty much all the work has been done. It's like you can't change things with, 2 weeks to go. What are you saying to her?
Go for it on property tax. So, like, replace as much of stamp duty as you can with a proportional property tax that hits people, and shoot the Tories' fox on stamp duty entirely by getting rid of it on shares, because that would be something that would get every single the city could stop whinging forever if you did that. And that's a stupid tax that is evaded by all of the smart guys, and only actual pensioners are really paying it. And it's very easy for us to say, but be bold. She's only going to have this job for a relatively short period of her working life. Those of us who've been out and will probably never get back in again know that those times are precious. She'll really regret not doing things more than she will she'll regret being cautious and not sort of by taking big steps.
The end of the show is here, and that means Escape Routes, where we talk about the movies, records, books, TV shows, or other cultural distractions that are getting us through this week and the budget in general. John Elledge, what about you?
This is a bit of a cheat because I trailed my excitement about it on the show a few weeks ago, but I've loved The Celebrity Traitors so much.
Not The Traitors again.
I have a backup one if you're not going to let me, but it's just brought me such joy. I was so worried that a number of things might happen. I thought everyone in it might be awful, and part of the joy of The Traitors is it looks like it's going to be this really sort of like horrible, mean show, but actually it's kind of weirdly life affirming the way people sort of make lifelong friendships on it, and it's actually quite sweet in a lot of ways. And it's just allowed a lot of slightly odd celebrities to be kind of slightly quirky at each other, and it's been absolutely delightful. There's people in there who I was barely aware of before, who I now absolutely adore. Stephen Fry, who I used to really love, and then kind of went off for a time. He's kind of gone up in my estimation again, but it turns out he's actually clever, not just TV clever. And it had an amazing ending. I really enjoyed it. Sorry.
Well, there you go. What can I say? Giles?
I mean, my recourse is history normally. I like to read old books about other times. So I just finished a biography of Wellington. A certain other podcast is doing Nelson. And, these are incredible times when the world was changed by these extraordinary people doing these incredibly dangerous things personally. And I can never get enough of reading about that period from around the time they chucked some tea into Boston Harbor to when Napoleon was taken off to St. Helena. Those are the most amazing years to read about, and I like reading them, and it puts a little bit of today in perspective. I mean, we should get over ourselves a bit.
When I was a kid, I thought they'd taken Napoleon to St. Helens, which I thought was a real cruel punishment, just to watch the rugby, maybe. I don't know. Mine is, I've been rewatching for the umpteenth time, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the Alec Guinness version. I just did a bonker last week on the forthcoming stage adaptation of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and I thought I should revisit this. And it is always incredible. The cast is, unbelievable. Alec Guinness, Hugh Bennett, just an absolute galaxy of incredible actors. And the thing that really strikes me is not just the fact that it, as we know, it presents espionage as really grim and seedy and ugly and lacking in a moral dimension, but how slow and quiet everything is. The world was slower and quieter. Direction is slower and quieter. Episodes kind of fade in and fade out. We're not having our lapels, constantly grabbed, and we don't feel yelled at. And I just think it's the most incredible piece of work. It really repays very close attention. And I think I realise now I watch it every 10 years or so, and I still find it just absolutely transfixing. It's available streaming all over the place, I guess. And that is the end of this budget edition of Oh God, What Now? Obviously, we'll be looking back on the actual thing when it actually happens and see how much of it we've got right. Giles Wilkes, thanks so much for joining us.
Been a pleasure.
And Jonn Elledge, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to Giles as well, because that's the least depressed I've come out of a conversation about the economy in years.
Yeah, it's been quite good, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I do hope you blame me if it goes horribly wrong now.
Oh, I will.
Guess what? We're not actually in the toilet. Anyway, listeners, thanks for listening. We hope you found it slightly cheering as well. Extra special thanks if you're listening via Patreon, the crowdfunding platform that's kept us in rude health for nearly 8 years now. Make a small contribution every month via Patreon and you'll keep us in good shape. You'll get every edition early and ad-free and our desirable merchandise. Follow the link in the show notes to find out how to do it. We would really appreciate it. And don't forget, if you've got questions for the panel, then send them to info@romaniacs.com. Oh, how old-fashioned it sounds. You might make but your emails next week. Thank you for listening. We'll see you at the end of the week.